Manhattan in the morning hums like a living engine, cabs threading yellow through the arteries of downtown, steam hissing up from iron grates, 1,000 coffee lids snapping into place. On mornings like this, you can almost believe the city knows you, that it's rooting for you. But New York doesn't root. It watches. And on the corner of Stone Street and Broadway, it was watching closely. Backhand index pointing right before we dive deeper, quick gut check, do you believe one small act of kindness can circle back years later and rewrite your life? Hold that thought. By the end of this story, you might look at the word fortune in a very different way. Richard Hale glanced at the dashboard clock, 8:03 a.m., and lifted one hand from the steering wheel to smooth the crease in his shirt cuff. The Mercedes idled steady, a low, expensive purr that drew side glances from pedestrians. He looked like the city's idea of a success story, late 40s, steel-gray temples with every hair obeying, jawline that said he belonged in a boardroom. In the tinted reflection, he was everything a Wall Street bio would promise. But the reflection never shows the foundation. It only shows the glass. He took a breath and held it there, as if oxygen could still a thought. It didn't. Not today. 2 nights ago, a risk model had coughed up a number that didn't make sense, then the market made a cruel kind of sense out of it. The firm sustained a hit they could absorb, if nothing else toppled. Which was exactly the kind of thought that invited the topple. The light turned red on the next block, and traffic bunched like a fist. To his left, a bike messenger cut around a delivery truck and cussed loud enough that a woman on the sidewalk barked back, "Watch it." Their argument dissolved into the roar of the city, the way everything did. He drummed the pad of his thumb along the steering wheel, counting beats. It was a habit from the old days, when he'd outweighted markets that chewed people and spit them out with their tie askew. Count the beats. Don't blink first. Numbers are nervous but they respect nerve. Movement at the crosswalk tugged his eyes. A girl, no older than 10, maybe, stood near the curb with a backpack that might have held all she had. Her sneakers slouched at the sides. The hoodie swallowed her wrists. She wasn't working the corner like the practiced ones with signs. No theatrics, no drawn letters on cardboard. Just a small, steady body trying to gather courage. She took 2 steps forward. Stopped. A car horn popped behind him, impatient and pointless. The girl looked past the line of vehicles like she was looking for permission. That was the first thing that got him, the way she asked the air before she asked anyone else. Then her gaze snagged on the shine of his hood, slid to the window, and, like the city itself, watched. Richard could have stared ahead and pretended not to notice. There's a way eyes learn to step over what hurts them. He knew that way. He'd learned it over decades of being the man who could not afford to feel at 9:30 a.m. She came closer. Careful steps. Small hands clasped like she was trying not to lose the last heat she had. He tapped the window button. It slid down an inch, then 2. Cold morning air touched the leather and the smell of the street, pretzel salt, diesel, the bitter edge of someone's cigarette, tangled with the faint cologne on his collar. "Sir," she said, voice thin but not broken. In the narrow gap, he saw eyes the color of black coffee and a steadiness in them that felt older than her bones. "Yes," he said, keeping his tone neutral. Not unkind. Not welcoming. A line where business could stand. I'm trying to get back to the countryside. School starts." She cleared her throat like the sentence had a thorn in it. "I just need enough to get home." He looked past her toward the curb. There was no adult hovering with a script. No angle. Just a girl and a backpack with one strap taped in 2 places. "Where's home?" he asked. "Hudson Valley." "Pine Hollow," she said, as if saying it fast would make it sound less far. He pictured the map in his head. Pine Hollow felt like a place with one traffic light and a diner that still made grilled cheese on diner bread, not artisanal sourdough. He could almost see a two-lane road shouldering off into woods, the trees holding secrets that the city would trivialize. "What about your parents?" he asked gently. Her fingers tightened over the backpack strap. "My mama passed. It's just me. A beat. And auntie. Auntie's up there." The words landed softly, like a napkin on a table, but the weight beneath them was heavier than any account he'd balanced. A siren curled somewhere far off. The traffic light blinked to yellow, then held red again as a pedestrian surge cascaded across the crosswalk. A street preacher lifted his voice at the corner, "Repent," and a woman in earbuds slipped right by, perfectly immune. Richard weighed a dozen responses. He could give her a 20 and a nod. He could roll the window up and mark this as the kind of regret that fades by lunchtime. He could ask for proof, for a phone number, for an adult, stiffen the moment with procedure until the soul leaked out. "Do you know how much a ticket costs?" he asked, because he needed one more breath. $38 on the bus, she said immediately. She'd done the math. I want to have some for food too." He nodded once. The way she'd said 38, certain, unembellished, left no room for scam. He remembered himself at 10, using exact numbers to prove to grown-ups that his need was real. "What's your name?" he said. "Maya," she said. "Maya Johnson." He registered the name without writing it down anywhere. That's how most miracles walk by, uncatalogued and unreconciled. "Maya," he repeated, and the name softened something in his mouth. "I'm Richard." Her lips twitched toward a smile, then retreated like it had felt too risky. A cyclist rapped a knuckle on his trunk, snapping his attention. The light had switched. The cars began to crawl, then glide. He should move. He should let the city close over this like water over a thrown stone. He didn't move. He slid the car into park, turned on the hazard lights, and felt a collective glare from the anonymous many lance the back of his neck. He was used to being a problem people forgave because his balance sheet said he deserved it. Today he'd risk their hornblast judgment anyway. "Hold on," he said, reaching for his wallet. The leather was smooth, expensive in the way the hand forgets to notice. His fingers slipped past cards and folded receipts until they found cash. He wasn't sure how much he had. He didn't carry much cash anymore. People like him didn't need to. He paused, the bills caught between thumb and forefinger. Behind the stillness, numbers unspooled, a margin call that had come in a pitch too low to hear until it was too late, a client with a polite voice and a threatened lawsuit woven neatly through the politeness, a trader who stopped making eye contact in the elevator. The floor in his mind tilted a degree. He steadied himself with a breath. "Actually," he said, "hold on one more second." He reached for the console and popped open the small compartment where he kept things he didn't want to think about, a spare cufflink, an old Metro card, a silver money clip his ex-wife had given him on a Christmas that now felt like an antique. The clip still held a crisp stack. He slid out a bill and glanced at the number in the corner. 1,000. He could cut a check for $1 million and feel less. Giving this bill to a child on a corner would be ridiculous. It would be reckless. It would be. He stopped the thought before it could turn into a scolding voice that sounded like his father's. The voice that once said, "You don't throw money at problems, you price them." Maya's hands had fallen to her sides, as if she'd already decided she'd asked too much of the day. She shifted back a tiny step, made a little more space for him to change his mind. "Sir," she said, almost apologizing for needing him, "if you can't." "How much do you need again?" he said, as if the answer could change anything. 38, she whispered. He looked at the 1,000 in his hand and felt something he hadn't felt in months, the freedom to be impractical. To be human first. He lifted the bill halfway, then lowered it, the thought returning with a briefcase and a tie, "This is absurd. Give her 40. Give her 100 if you're feeling generous. Don't make a scene with $1,000. He pulled his hand back into the car. Maya's eyes flickered, not with disappointment but with the polite resignation of someone who rehearses endings before they happen. "How far is Pine Hollow?" he asked, stalling for the space in which he might listen for something other than his own logic. 2 hours, she said. "I can walk from the stop." "Do you have someone waiting at the other end?" "Your aunt." She nodded quickly. "She said if I can get there before Friday, they'll still let me start." "They." Some school office with a secretary who measured compassion by deadlines. He'd met their type 1,000 times in different suits. He thought of the firm's conference room, the varnished table, the sickly plants, the windows that looked heroic until the numbers bled on the screen. He thought of the call he'd taken an hour where a man who'd made twice his money in good years would threaten to sue him for the small portion he'd lost in a bad one. He thought of the secretary at that man's office, who'd learned by mimicry to speak like a lawsuit in heels. And in that thin seam, between a red light turning green and somebody's horn already impatient, he allowed himself to wonder what it would feel like to do one thing that didn't defend his power. "Okay," he said, the word surprising him with the relief it carried. "Okay." He folded the 1,000 into his palm and looked at her. Not through her. At her. "Maya, how old did you say you were?" 10, she said. He nodded once. 10 is brave, he murmured, and some old memory nudged his ribs. 10 years old, a public school cafeteria, a teacher who'd slipped him a sandwich when he'd forgot his lunch twice in a week. He'd built a fortress on that mercy and then pretended he'd done it alone. A police car eased around the corner. The officer inside glanced once, noted the hazard lights, measured the make of the car, and let it go. The city made allowances for certain people, until it didn't. Richard closed his fingers, knuckles whitening around the bill. He set his elbow on the window frame, opened his hand partway, and stopped again. What if I just bought the ticket?" he said, hearing the compromise in his own voice, the way he tried to tame generosity into paperwork. "I can buy it," she said quickly, protective of her dignity. "I promise." "I won't," she cut herself off before she said waste it. The word hovered anyway, bruising the air. He considered the 1,000 like it was radioactive. Maybe it was. Money is neutral until it isn't. In the wrong moment, it can hollow a person out or fill them with the belief that they're seen. He'd spent a lifetime pretending the first wasn't his problem and the second was his product. He looked away from the bill and back at the child. Her hair needed a detangler. Her hoodie needed a wash. Her eyes didn't need anything except a world that would stop requiring so much proof. Another wave of pedestrians spilled into the crosswalk, bottling traffic again. An older woman paused near Maya and whispered, "You okay, baby?" Maya nodded, smiled quick, and the woman kept walking, her tote bag bumping against her hip. Richard cleared his throat. "If I give you," he swallowed the word this because even saying it felt too big. "If I give you money, do you have somewhere safe to go right now? Before the bus?" "Yes," she said. "The shelter on Water Street. They said I can leave my bag in the office if I get a ticket today." He allowed himself a small, private sigh. There was a system around her, however fragile. He lifted his hand again. "Would this be enough?" he asked, as if he'd pulled out a 50. Her gaze fell to the bill and stopped. Everything about her went very, very still, like the moment in a storm when the air forgets to breathe. She didn't reach for it. The city's noise bled away to a far-off tunnel. Her eyes flicked to his face to be sure he meant it. "Is that?" Her voice thinned in disbelief. "Sir, that's too much." He almost smiled at the audacity of goodness calling itself too much. He'd signed checks that turned skyscrapers into commodities. He'd authorized transfers with more zeros than most people saw in a lifetime. Those signatures cost him nothing. This small moment asked him for everything he respected without admitting it. "It's just a number," he said lightly. "Is it enough?" Her throat worked. She nodded, a quick, shocked motion. It's more than enough. He heard it then, the unvarnished gratitude, unperformed and unbargained. It pressed against something in him that had calcified around old disappointments. He didn't know what to do with that pressure except breathe and keep looking at her. Good, he said, softer. He started to extend his hand through the window. And the phone in his jacket pocket began to vibrate. Once. Twice. Relentless, insistent. The exact rhythm of panic he recognized from certain clients. He kept his hand outstretched anyway. The buzzing continued. He dragged his eyes to the caller ID. Harrington and Bly LLP. The firm's primary counsel. He felt the name like a tightening around his stomach. Excuse me, he murmured to Maya, lowering the bill to his lap for a second that already felt dangerous. He answered. Richard. Where are you? Came the voice he'd come to associate with expensive clarity. Our 8:15 advanced. They moved. You're needed now. On Stone, 2 minutes away, he said, a lie the city forgave as easily as the cop had forgiven his hazards. We've had developments, the voice said. No greeting, no air. The portfolio exposure is worse than indicated. We might be looking at an involuntary liquidation scenario if the margin calls cascade today. I need you here. Words like involuntary and liquidation should have tasted clinical. They didn't. They tasted like metal. I'll be there, he said, and ended the call because a child was still waiting at his window for a decision that would outlive this day. He looked back at Maya, feeling the world tilt another quiet degree. He didn't want to bring the sourness of grown-up disaster into the space between them. Not yet. Not here. Sorry, he said. Work. She nodded, understanding more than anyone should at 10. It's okay. He studied her, searching for any reason to make this moment smaller. He found none that didn't also make him smaller. Hold out your hand, he said. She lifted her palm. It wasn't the palm of a beggar. It was a little worker's palm, nicked in places he couldn't see, steady in a way that dared the world to doubt it. He placed the bill there and closed her fingers over it. Her breath hitched like she'd swallowed a gasp. When she looked up, her eyes were glassy at the edges but held. Thank you, she whispered. The 2 words sounded like they knew they would never be enough, and promised to try anyway. Traffic pressed forward, squeezing his rear bumper in impatient nudges. The city tried to absorb them into its motion again. Is it enough? He asked, even though he could see the answer shaking in her shoulders. It's more than enough, she said, voice firmer now. I'll get the ticket. I'll keep the rest safe. Good, he said, a little louder, like he could bless the vow with volume. Get to your aunt. Start school. She nodded and stepped back, clutching the backpack with one arm and the bill with a careful fist, like both could break if handled wrong. Maya, he called, before the city stole the chance. She stopped. You're going to be okay. Her smile this time was quick and real and not safe at all. You too, she said, as if she already knew something about him he didn't. She turned and disappeared into the current of pedestrians, small and surely seen by the only eyes that mattered in that minute, his. He exhaled and slipped the car back into drive. The hazard lights winked off. The Mercedes nosed into the stream like a yacht into choppy water. He caught a final glimpse of the corner in his side mirror, the preacher's raised hand, the pretzel cart's white steam, and a slice of gray hoodie moving toward Water Street. The phone buzzed again. He let it. For a few blocks, he drove without the radio, without the morning finance show that usually queued up like caffeine. The silence wasn't quiet. It replayed the way the 1,000 had felt in his hand, too light, too heavy, exactly right, and the way the word enough could change shape depending on who was saying it. At Broad and Beaver, a billboard loomed with a bank slogan that suddenly sounded cruel. We're with you every step of the way. The word seemed to grin down at the sidewalk, where a man leaned against a building with a paper cup and yesterday's haircut. He turned left on instinct, avoiding the pothole he'd avoided for 7 years. The day began to stack appointments in his head again: 8:17, legal; 8:30, crisis; 9:05, investor call; 10 o'clock, damage control; noon, a sandwich he wouldn't taste. Beneath the stack, a new line item wrote itself in invisible ink: Maya Johnson, Pine Hollow, 10 is brave. By the time he pulled into the parking garage beneath the tower, the call from council had hardened into a to-do list that would demand all of him and take even more. The elevator doors closed on his reflection. He looked tidy enough to win a prize and felt like a hinge about to fail. On floor 34, the reception area was too shiny. The way expensive spaces sometimes are, to distract you from the news you will receive inside them. The receptionist smiled because her job told her to. His assistant handed him a folder with pages that had been stapled by hands that shook a little. "Morning," she said, voice pitched to the exact register that asked if he'd slept. He didn't answer the question she hadn't asked. "Conference room A?" he said. "Already waiting," she said, and he could tell by the way her eyes slid sideways that waiting meant edged and armed. He reached for the door handle, then stopped. One clean breath. One memory of a small hand closing over a bill as big as a door. If this is the hour everything breaks, he thought, let one thing I did today not break anyone. He pushed the door open and walked into the room that would try to break him. Somewhere 2 miles south, a little girl in a gray hoodie tucked a bill into the hidden pocket of a backpack and walked toward Water Street, counting steps in her head, 1, 2, 3, like someone practicing a new language. Somewhere north, a town named Pine Hollow went on with its quiet and did not yet know it would be the place a child would learn the weight and lift of the word enough. The city watched, neutral and unhelpful. It always did. And so the story began, not with a bang, but with a hand, and a girl, and a number that was both too much and just right, and a man who did not yet know how quickly a foundation can go from steel to sand. The morning after his meeting, Richard Hale stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office, 34 stories above the city. The skyline stretched out like a promise, but this morning, it looked less like glass towers and more like a cliff's edge. The markets had turned savage overnight. What was supposed to be a temporary setback had grown teeth. Screens flickered with red arrows plunging south, numbers bleeding faster than any strategy could mend. Traders barked into phones. Assistants shuffled past with files clutched to their chests, eyes wide like soldiers bracing for war. Richard adjusted his tie. His reflection in the glass still looked like a man in control, but he could feel it, that faint vibration beneath the marble floors. The building wasn't trembling. His world was. By noon, the partners gathered in conference room A. The table gleamed under the lights, but the atmosphere was brittle. Andrew Bly, legal counsel, spread out a thick file. "We're exposed," he said flatly. "Foreign equities are bleeding. The startups we backed last spring. Dead weight. And housing derivatives," he trailed off, sliding the file closer to Richard. Richard didn't need to look. He knew the numbers. He'd seen them all night. One of the partners, a man who had once toasted Richard at a Hamptons gala, leaned forward. "Tell me this is temporary, Richard. Tell me we're not heading into collapse." Richard kept his expression steady. "We've seen storms before. We'll weather this." But the words hung empty, like a flag over a sinking ship. Within days, whispers turned into rumors, and rumors into front-page news. Hale and Company. Investments on the brink of collapse. Clients flee amid market chaos. The photographs were cruel. Richard caught mid-stride, jaw clenched, coat collar up against the wind, looking less like a titan and more like a fugitive. Calls came at all hours. Angry investors demanding their money back. Old friends whose voices now sounded unfamiliar, cold. Richard's phone buzzed until even silence felt heavy. Then came the lawsuits. The first envelope arrived on a Thursday morning. A hedge fund in Boston was suing for gross negligence. Richard scanned the pages, words like fraudulent misrepresentation burning through the paper. By Friday, another came, this time from a retired billionaire who had trusted Richard with his fortune. The letter wasn't just legal. It was personal. The man accused him of betrayal. Each envelope stacked higher on his desk, until the weight of them seemed heavier than the skyscraper itself. On Monday, the police came. Not with sirens, not with handcuffs, at least not yet. But they escorted him from his office in front of flashing cameras. Reporters shouted questions like arrows. "Mr. Hale, are you being charged with fraud? Did you know your firm was overleveraged? Are you facing jail time?" Richard didn't answer. He walked with his chin high, though every step felt like stone chained to his ankles. The humiliation burned hotter than fear. He had spent decades building a name that commanded respect, and in one morning it was dragged through the mud for the city to trample. That night, news anchors dissected his downfall on primetime television. Once they had praised him as a financial genius. Now they dissected his arrogance, his mistakes, his greed. Strangers who had never met him spoke with certainty about his motives. By the end of the month, the banks came calling. The polite voices that once courted his business were gone. Now they were clinical, ruthless. "Mr. Hale, your loans are due. Immediate repayment is required. But you know the market. This isn't about the market, Mr. Hale. This is about your debt." They didn't care that he'd been their prized client for years. They didn't care about loyalty. Banks don't remember favors. Only numbers. He sold what he could. First the vacation home in the Hamptons. Then the yacht. Then the artwork collected from decades of success. Each piece auctioned off to strangers who smiled as they carried away fragments of his life. But the debt still outweighed the assets. Always more to pay. Always less left to give. The hardest loss came when the penthouse was foreclosed. Richard had stood in that living room, looking out at Central Park through glass that stretched floor to ceiling. He remembered hosting parties there, champagne flutes clinking, jazz humming, women in gowns laughing beneath chandeliers. He remembered quiet nights too, when he sat alone in the dim light with a glass of scotch, staring at the city that bowed to his success. The day he left, movers carried out the last of his furniture. Neighbors, men he had once invited to rooftop dinners, avoided his eyes in the hallway. The doorman, usually full of smiles, only nodded stiffly as Richard walked out for the last time. He carried 2 boxes, nothing more. The rest had been stripped away. His new apartment in Queens smelled faintly of dust and paint. A narrow stairwell led up to a space barely big enough for a bed, a couch, and a small table. The wallpaper was peeling in the corner. The pipes groaned when the heat turned on. It wasn't luxury. It wasn't even comfort. It was survival. For the first time in decades, Richard was anonymous. No headlines here. No boardrooms. No investors banging on the door. Just neighbors who didn't know his name, and didn't care. At night, he sat by the window, staring at his reflection in the glass. Not the polished man in cufflinks, but a man hollowed out. His jaw had softened. His hair had thinned. His eyes carried the gray weight of shame. The silence was the loudest thing he had ever known. Calls stopped coming. The friends who once toasted him on yachts and rooftop parties disappeared. Some cut ties openly, blaming him for their financial losses. Others simply faded away, their silence sharper than any words. One evening, he called a man he had mentored years ago, someone whose career he had built with his own hand. The line rang 3 times before a cool voice answered. "Richard. I'm sorry. I can't be associated with you right now." The click that followed was louder than any courtroom gavel. Months passed. Seasons turned. And Richard learned what it meant to lose not just wealth, but identity. He stood in line at the grocery store, wallet thin in his pocket. He paid bills in careful installments, always a week late. He avoided looking at the news, because his name was still there sometimes, a cautionary tale. And each night, when the city quieted and the traffic thinned, he sat at the window with the lights off. Watching. Thinking. Remembering. He thought of the girl sometimes. Maya. The one with the gray hoodie and the worn sneakers. He had given her $1,000 without thinking twice. It had felt reckless at the time, almost absurd. But now, as his empire crumbled around him, it was the one decision he didn't regret. Because for one moment, on one corner of Stone Street, he hadn't been Richard Hale the millionaire. He had simply been a man with the power to help a child. And somewhere, though he couldn't know it, that child was holding on to the seed he had planted. A seed that was growing quietly, even as his world turned to dust. The circle was already turning. He just couldn't see it yet. 10 years had the power to turn shadows into stories. For Maya Johnson, 10 years meant transforming from the timid little girl in a gray hoodie, her sneakers caving at the sides, her voice barely louder than traffic, to a young woman whose presence filled a room. She was no longer the child asking strangers for bus fare. She was someone who had carried a single act of kindness in her heart for a decade and allowed it to shape every decision she made. It had all started with that $1,000 bill. The bus ticket from Manhattan to Pine Hollow had cost only $38. Maya bought it the same day, standing nervously in line at the terminal, clutching the crisp bill like it might vanish if she let go too long. The clerk behind the glass gave her a side glance when she slid the money under, as though wondering why a child was holding such a large bill. But Maya kept her eyes steady. When the bus pulled into Pine Hollow, her aunt was waiting, small, wiry, her shoulders stooped under years of labor. The hug they shared was desperate and grounding. For the first time in weeks, Maya exhaled. She showed her aunt the bill and the change folded neatly in her backpack. Her aunt's eyes had filled with tears. "Child, where did you?" "A man gave it to me," Maya whispered. "He said it was enough." That night, they sat at the kitchen table of her aunt's modest home, a creaky wooden place with walls that smelled of soap and old firewood. Together, they planned what to do with the leftover money. Her aunt wanted to save most of it, but Maya insisted they buy ingredients. Flour. Sugar. Oil. A frying pan from the thrift store. The next day, she began frying cookies and little pies, selling them from a small table at the corner of Main Street. It was hard. The oil splattered, leaving tiny burns on her skin. The smell clung to her clothes, so classmates whispered that she smelled like grease. But Maya stood there day after day, her hands blistered, her smile unwavering. She knew she was planting something. And every time she thought about giving up, she remembered the man's words, 10 is brave. At 14, Maya had saved enough to buy a second-hand bicycle. It was rusty, but it gave her freedom. She used it to deliver snacks to neighbors who couldn't leave their homes, an old widow who lived at the edge of town, a couple with a newborn, a teacher who slipped her a few extra coins each time. At 15, she expanded her recipes. Cupcakes. Small loaves of bread. Even lemonade on hot days. She learned to stretch her money like elastic, negotiating with suppliers, experimenting with ingredients, never wasting a crumb. Her aunt often shook her head in awe. "You work harder than women twice your age." But Maya wasn't just working. She was building. Quietly, patiently, she was laying bricks no one else could see. By 16, she had saved enough to rent a tiny kiosk in town. It was nothing more than a booth with a counter and a single shelf, but to Maya, it was a castle. She painted a sign herself, Maya's Treats. Customers came. Some out of curiosity. Some because her smile was as warm as her cookies. Many because they could taste her determination baked into every bite. She began hiring after-school help, 2 high schoolers, younger than her but eager to earn. Save your money, she told them firmly. Don't spend it all on sneakers. Save, even if it's small. They listened, because she spoke like someone who had clawed her way out of hunger. At 18, Maya opened her second shop. This one sat near the bus stop, perfectly placed to catch travelers. She decorated the window with hand-painted lettering and jars of bright candies. Travelers picked up snacks for their journeys, often leaving with more than they had planned. At 19, she opened her third. This one was bigger, in the heart of Pine Hollow. She hired 5 employees, all young people who needed a chance, just like she once had. She paid fair wages, encouraged them to study, and treated them like family. By then, people in Pine Hollow no longer saw her as the girl with taped-up sneakers. They saw her as Maya Johnson, the young woman who had built something out of nothing. The girl who had turned sugar and flour into a foundation for her future. And yet, despite her progress, she never allowed herself to forget that it had all started with a single moment, a stranger lowering a car window and believing in her enough to give. Some nights, after closing her shops, Maya would sit in her small rented apartment and replay the memory. The way the man had looked at her, not with pity, but with recognition. The way he had asked, "Is it enough?" and waited for her answer like it mattered. She hadn't even known his name. Only his face, his steady voice, his silver temples. But she remembered every detail. And she had promised herself that if she ever had the chance, she would find him again. Not to pay him back, but to show him what his kindness had built. At 20, Maya was a college student. She studied business at the community college, paying her tuition with the profits from her shops. Her hands were still calloused from years of work, but her stride carried confidence. She wore neat jeans and a crisp blouse, her hair pulled into a tidy bun. One morning, she packed her new navy blue backpack, zipped it tight, and bought a bus ticket back to New York City. Not for ambition. Not for business. For gratitude. The city greeted her the same way it had years before, horns blaring, steam rising from grates, crowds pressing like waves. But this time, Maya didn't feel small. She walked with her head high, weaving through the chaos with purpose. Her first stop was Wall Street. She stood on the corner of Stone Street, the same spot where she had once approached him. She closed her eyes and could almost see herself there again, small, nervous, holding her backpack strap like a lifeline. She whispered to herself, "This is where everything began." She asked around. Shop owners. Taxi drivers. Even doormen in front of the tall buildings. "Do you know Richard Hale?" she asked, describing him as best she could. Tall, gray hair at the temples, wore suits, worked in investments. Most shook their heads. Some frowned. A few muttered, "He used to be rich. Lost it all." Those words struck her like a blow. Lost it all? How could that be? The man she remembered had radiated power, as if wealth itself bowed to him. But the more people she asked, the more the story repeated. Court cases. Foreclosures. A downfall whispered about, then forgotten. Maya's heart clenched. Gratitude pulled her forward, but dread dragged at her heels. What if he had disappeared entirely? What if she was too late? By late afternoon, she found herself standing in front of a rundown apartment building in Queens. The bricks were stained and peeling, the fire escape rusted, the windows covered with blinds that sagged unevenly. It didn't fit the image she carried of him, but the directions led her here. She hesitated at the entrance. Her palms were clammy. Her throat dry. What if he didn't remember her? What if he didn't want to? But gratitude doesn't wait for perfect moments. It demands action. Maya squared her shoulders, pushed open the door, and climbed the stairs. The hallway smelled of bleach and fried onions. Her footsteps echoed on the cracked linoleum floor. Apartment 4B. The number was barely hanging on the door, the metal tarnished with age. A strip of tape clung to the peephole. She raised her hand. Knocked once. Twice. 3 times. The sound seemed to vibrate through the walls. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow. Hesitant. The knob turned. The door opened. And there he was. Richard Hale. Older. Weary. His once impeccable hair now thinner, grayer. His jaw softer, his eyes heavy with a quiet shame. He wore a plain shirt, sleeves rolled, nothing like the man she remembered in a Mercedes. But even so, Maya knew him instantly. Her heart clenched. For 10 years, she had carried his image like a talisman. Now, here he was, real and fragile. "Mister," she faltered, then steadied herself. "Richard?" He blinked at her, confusion knitting his brow. "Yes. Do I know you?" Maya swallowed hard. Her voice trembled, but her words carried the weight of a decade. "You don't remember me. But 10 years ago, on Stone Street, you gave me $1,000. For a moment, his face was blank. Then, slowly, recognition flickered in his eyes like a match-catching flame. Maya smiled through tears. "I've been looking for you. I just wanted to say, thank you. That money changed my life." The city had grown louder in 10 years. Or maybe Maya just heard it differently now. Back when she was 10, the noise of Manhattan had swallowed her whole, the blare of horns, the buzz of phones, the clipped heels on pavement. Now, at 20, she walked among the chaos with a steadier stride. Her navy backpack hugged her shoulders, filled not with taped-up notebooks but with class binders and textbooks. She was no longer just surviving. She was building. But beneath her confidence, a quiet ache followed her. The weight of an unfinished story. She had promised herself that she would find the man who had once lowered his car window and changed her life with a single act of generosity. College life wasn't easy. By day, Maya studied business at community college, poring over textbooks, sitting in lectures, asking the kind of questions professors loved. By evening, she was at one of her shops, kneading dough, checking receipts, or guiding her employees with the same gentle firmness her aunt had once used with her. Most of her classmates had no idea she was a business owner. To them, she was the quiet young woman who always looked tired but never missed a deadline. Her professors saw her hunger and often said she had the sharpness of someone who understood what real risk looked like. But no one saw the nights when she collapsed into bed after 16-hour days, hands raw from baking, mind raw from equations. No one saw the times she skipped meals so her staff could be paid on time. Through it all, she clung to the memory of Richard Hale, the man who had once said, "10 is brave." She wanted to show him what his kindness had grown into. She wanted him to see that his money hadn't been wasted, that it had been planted, watered, and multiplied. The search began with whispers. Maya started at Stone Street, the corner where everything had begun. She stood there for a long time, watching the suits rush by, the steam rise from the grates. She closed her eyes and could almost see herself again, small, nervous, asking for $38 to get back to school. "Do you know Richard Hale?" she asked an old man selling pretzels at the corner. The man squinted. "Used to be a big shot, right? Fancy cars, fancy suits. I think he lost it all years back." She moved on, asking doormen outside the glass towers, cab drivers at the curbs, even clerks at coffee shops. Some shook their heads. Some frowned. A few muttered the same story, "Yeah, he was rich once. Fell hard. Don't know where he is now." Each answer tightened the knot in her chest. Gratitude kept her moving, but fear whispered, "What if he's gone? What if you're too late?" She spent days tracing his name. At the public library, she scrolled through old newspapers on microfilm. Headlines screamed, Hale and Company. Crumbles amid market crash. Wall Street titan faces lawsuits. There were photos, too, Richard in a suit, jaw clenched, surrounded by flashing cameras. The articles painted him as a cautionary tale. Some called him reckless. Some called him arrogant. Few mentioned his generosity. No headline said, "The man who gave a little girl $1,000. One article mentioned his penthouse foreclosure. Another referenced his move to an undisclosed residence. The trail went cold there. For weeks, she asked around. Some claimed he had left the city. Others said he was in hiding. One bitter former colleague spat, "He got what he deserved." Maya refused to believe that was the end of his story. Finally, a lead surfaced. An older cab driver she spoke to on Lexington squinted, thinking. Richard Hale? Yeah, I drove him once. Took him out to Queens. Small apartment complex. Didn't look like the guy I used to see in suits. Looked tired. Her chest thudded. Queens. Where? He scribbled an address on the back of an old receipt. That evening, she found herself standing in front of a rundown building in Queens. The bricks were chipped, the fire escape rusted, the windows covered with sagging blinds. It wasn't what she had pictured. The man she remembered had seemed untouchable, wrapped in marble and glass. Now, this. She hesitated at the entrance. Her palms clammy, her throat dry. But gratitude doesn't wait for perfect moments. It demands action. Maya squared her shoulders and stepped inside. The hallway smelled of bleach and fried onions. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead. Her footsteps echoed against the cracked linoleum as she climbed the stairs. Apartment 4B. The number hung crooked on the door, tarnished and dull. A strip of tape clung to the peephole. Maya raised her hand. Knocked once. Twice. 3 times. The sound reverberated down the hall. Silence. Then footsteps. Slow. Hesitant. The knob turned. The door opened. And there he was. Richard Hale. Older. Thinner. His once polished hair now gray, his jaw softer, his shoulders stooped. He wore a plain shirt, sleeves rolled, the fabric faded from too many washes. His eyes, once sharp with pride, now carried the heavy weariness of a man who had seen too much loss. But even so, Maya knew him instantly. Her throat tightened. She had carried his image like a talisman for 10 years. Now here he was, real, fragile, human. "Mister," she faltered, then steadied her voice. "Richard?" He blinked, confusion clouding his face. "Yes. Do I know you?" Maya swallowed, her eyes stinging. "You don't remember me. But 10 years ago, on Stone Street, you gave me $1,000. For a moment, his face was blank. Then, slowly, recognition flickered in his eyes. A memory. A street corner. A little girl in a hoodie. His mouth parted. "You." Maya smiled through tears. "Yes. Me. I've been looking for you. I just wanted to say, thank you. That money changed my life." Richard opened the door wider, almost dazed, and stepped back. "Come in." The apartment was modest, bare walls, a small couch, a single table stacked with unopened bills. Maya's eyes softened as she took it in. This was not the home of the man she had remembered. But it was the home of the man who had saved her. They sat across from each other, silence heavy at first. Finally, Maya spoke. "With the money you gave me, I bought a bus ticket home. With the rest, I started selling cookies. Just small things at first. But I saved, and I kept building. By 16, I had a little shop. By 18, another. By 19, 3 shops. And now? I'm in college. Studying business. Paying for it myself. Richard listened, his hands clasped together, his eyes locked on her. For the first time in years, tears welled in his eyes. You did all that, from $1,000, he whispered. Maya shook her head. Not just from the money. From the belief. You didn't just hand me cash. You gave me proof that someone believed I was worth helping. That was enough to carry me through every hard day. Her voice broke, but she pushed through. I owe you everything, Mr. Hale. Richard leaned back, his chest rising and falling with something between sorrow and awe. I've lost everything since then. The fortune, the company, the friends. All gone. Maya reached across the table, her hand steady. Not everything. You gave me a life. And now. I want to give you something back. The silence in the small apartment stretched long. Outside, Queens buzzed with ordinary life, kids shouting on the sidewalk, a siren wailing faintly in the distance, someone's television bleeding laughter through the thin walls. But inside, the world seemed to pause, holding its breath between the two people at the table. Maya sat forward, her hands folded, her eyes unwavering. She looked not at the worn walls, not at the stack of unpaid bills, but at the man across from her, the man who had once given her enough hope to change everything. I want to help you, she said softly. Richard blinked, as though the words were too foreign to fit into his ears. For years, he had been the one who offered, the one who gave. To be on the receiving end now, to hear a child he once pitied offer him salvation, was a reversal he could hardly swallow. Maya, his voice was rough, unpracticed in tenderness. I can't accept your money. You've worked for every bit of it. That's yours. Yours alone. She shook her head, firm but gentle. It's not just mine. It's ours. You gave me the seed. I just grew it. And now it's time I gave something back. Richard leaned back, a bitter smile tugging at his mouth. You don't know what it's like to lose everything. I was a man people feared in the boardroom. I signed papers that moved millions. Now look at me. He gestured at the faded curtains, the worn carpet. I can't take your charity. I won't. Maya's eyes softened. This isn't charity. It's gratitude. He looked away, jaw tightening. Pride was a stubborn companion, one he had carried even as the rest of his life crumbled. To let go of it now felt like losing the last shard of who he had been. She reached into her backpack and pulled out an envelope. She slid it across the table. The paper whispered against the wood, a sound louder than the sirens outside. Open it, she said. His fingers trembled as he lifted the flap. Inside was a check. The numbers on it made his breath catch. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start again. Enough to climb. Enough to matter. Maya, he swallowed hard. I can't. I can't take this. She leaned closer, her voice steady, carrying the weight of 10 years of determination. Mr. Hale, you once gave me $1,000 without knowing what it would do. You didn't question. You didn't demand proof. You just believed. And because of that, I built a life. I'm standing here because of you. If you turn this down, it won't just be pride. It'll be saying that what you gave me never mattered. Her words pierced him. He closed his eyes, memories crashing, Stone Street, her small voice asking for help, her wide eyes when he pressed the bill into her hand. Back then, it had seemed reckless. Now, it seemed like the only thing he had ever done right. When he opened his eyes, tears blurred his vision. His voice cracked. I'll accept it. But only as a loan. One day, I'll pay you back. With interest. Maya smiled, relief and pride shining through her tears. Then it's a loan. They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was full. Full of possibility. Full of redemption. Richard looked at her and saw not the little girl in a hoodie but a woman, strong, steady, resilient. She had carried his kindness like a torch, and now she was handing it back to him, brighter than before. And for the first time in years, Richard Hale felt something he thought he'd lost forever. Hope. Weeks later, Richard walked down a crowded street in Manhattan, not in a Mercedes, not in a tailored suit, but with a spring in his step and a new plan under his arm. He was starting again, this time not as the untouchable Wall Street titan, but as a man rebuilt by grace. Maya stood beside him, guiding him toward a modest office space she had helped him rent. Together, they stepped inside, not as millionaire and orphan, not as savior and saved, but as partners in a circle of kindness that had refused to break. And somewhere deep down, they both knew this was only the beginning. Because sometimes, the greatest fortunes aren't measured in dollars, but in the lives we change, and the ones who change us in return.